Here I'm looking at the, excuse me, study questions from Module 4, which, as you know, consists entirely of clips from films, deathbed scenes, dying scenes, people at the end of their lives. And I think clearly they're open-ended questions. It's a matter of, whenever it's a matter of you looking at a piece of art, and these are all pieces of art, and this is drama scenes, and just sort of interpreting them and finding something in them. So they're all very open-ended. And I really just meant to give a kind of an array of how these filmmakers imagine death, imagine dying, not death, imagine dying and its significance and the significance that it's given, the characterization of it. And I think there's a very wide variety of ways of doing that. It's represented by these scenes. The Barbarian Invasions, it's a good film, and it's a good scene, as you can see. And if I've said anything in the videos, I don't know if they're kind of snarky about it, I apologize. It stands on its own. It's a very loving idea of what death can be, or what dying can be. This man who has terminal cancer decides to have assisted suicide, and whatever the ethics of that may be, the way that it's characterized is that the family and his children and his ex-wives or ex-girlfriends and his friends come together and say goodbye to him, and it's all really loving and really rather touching and beautiful, but peaceful and natural. And although it's somber, it's also very humane and loving. And it's a sort of a view of almost an ideal view, I think, from the contemporary point of view of what dying should be. It is totally and completely opposed by the view of dying, at least this one man's dying. One man's death from Magnolia, the great Jason Robards, who has this long deathbed confessional soliloquy about what a horrible person he's been, and the huge mistakes that he's made, mostly having to do with his wife and son. What a selfish jerk he's been, and how filled with remorse and regret he is, and how his death is not a peaceful one. His death is a kind of an agony of guilt and regret and remorse. And, I'm not saying that the filmmaker is essentially necessarily saying that everyone dies that way. Clearly they don't, but some people do, right? I mean, death is not always this sort of peaceful, I love you, no matter what you did in life, you were great, and we love you and we'll miss you. It can also be a man dying alone, or dying, the only person he has to talk to is a stranger who's paid to take care of him, agonizing about what a terrible person he's been, and how death is not bringing any sort of closure. It's just a time to regret the kind of, it's really, whatever it says, it's so different from the Barbarian Invasions that I couldn't help but put them both up, sort of asking, well, what do you think? Which gets closer to the truth, if there is such a thing. And then finally, the absolutely crazy and funny and tragic view of dying in All That Jazz, which is just one of those great 70s films. Roy Scheider, basically, it's all very, I'm an old guy. I like old films, although Magnolia and Barbarian Invasions are at least from the 90s, where All That Jazz is from the late 70s, I believe. But the great Bob Fosse, who was this legendary choreographer who became a legendary film director, really, it's about himself and his own fears and his own views and his own criticism of himself. And this guy who imagines his death as a show, as we're going to put a big show on about my death, and singing with Ben Vereen, and the great Ben Vereen, my goodness. Roy Scheider, boy, I'm sorry, I'm an old guy, but you're not going to get a Ben Vereen, Roy Scheider today. Nope, sorry. It's just fantastic, but it's absurd, and it's really about It's somber. It's very somber. And boy, that last thing where he's just the nurse zips up the body bag is the reality of it, right? That's what's so brilliant about that. It's this great fantasy scene about my I'm going to go out with a bang, and then after that very last part with the zipping up of the body bag, the reality of it, right, as opposed to the rationalization or the imaginary part of it. It's incredible scene. I don't know, maybe not so easy to characterize, but this man who's been a showman all his life is thinking of his own death the way a showman does. You put on a show about your death, but then, what's the reality of it? There's hints within the number that, he regrets the way he's lived his life. Although instead, it's not the pure regret of Jason Robards in Magnolia. He's able to ironically sort of smile through the pain and keep, the show must go on. But at the end of the day, he realizes he hasn't lived his life very well. These three things there's no one way of looking at them, but I do think that they present a very interesting array of ways that we imagine dying.